record this real quick. So I'm John Clark, Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Advanced Business Solutions. And I do have a poll up as I'm doing this introduction. Love to get your feedback. If your organization is going to need to be CMMC certified, don't be afraid to say no or we don't know, because honestly, I don't know about ABS's status, and I'm going to be learning right along with you guys. Tucker, if you'll take me to the agenda here, please, sir. So what I know personally, again, I'm about as uneducated as some of us on the call. Recently, there was some new rules announced around CMMC that Tucker and Brian are going to go through. They're going to give us a kind of an overview of what's going on, a recap of how we got here, when it's going to be enforced, who does it apply to, which level do you need, and running through a readiness process, which is Tucker and ABS's purview. We help clients get ready for compliances, whether it's CMMC or otherwise. And then Brian is going to be coming from a perspective of the C3PAO, your auditor in the CMMC process. Lots of acronyms are going to be thrown around. Don't be shy. Throw it in the chat, throw it in the question area, whatever you have. I'm going to sit and watch this while the guys are educating all of us. So please ask your questions. Again, Brian is going to come from the perspective of the auditor, and Tucker will be coming from the perspective of helping you get ready for Brian to come in. So with that said, Brian, would you like to introduce yourself and get us going here today?
Yeah, thanks, John. So as John mentioned, my name is Brian Kirk. I serve as the subject matter expert on CMMC at Cherry Bekaert. And so Cherry Bekaert is a full-service accounting and advisory firm. We were one of the first companies to become an authorized C3PAO back in January of 2021. And so throughout that time, going back all the way really to 2017, with DFAR 7012, we've been helping contractors comply with DFARs. And then as it's kind of morphed into the CMC program. So as John mentioned, looking forward to this webinar and providing insights from the perspective of a C3PAO.
Thanks, Brian. My name is Tucker Oldham, and I work with Advanced Business Solutions. We are a managed service provider in Louisville, Kentucky. And as our customers who had outsourced IT to us started going down the compliance path about 3 years ago, we started a consulting department that works a lot in compliance and help folks get themselves not only ready for CMMC, but other compliances as well. And we actually use Brian and Cherry for our own internal audits. So have developed a very good partnership with them, and started down the CMMC path, particularly over the last couple of months when the ruling started to be finalized, things along those lines.
Tucker, do you want to see the results of our poll real quick?
Sure.
So 6 people are with me. We got a good mix here.
Yep.
And
it doesn't surprise me at all. When I looked through the participant list, there are lots of folks on the call that know they're going to need to be certified, and in the marketplace as a whole, there's a lot of folks that aren't sure whether or not it's going to apply to them at all. And so I wanted to spend a little time up front, John, kind of talking about how we got here. Very quick, Brian can talk in much more detail over this, but the CMMC certification is basically for contractors that are doing business with the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense, over a number of years, has tried to tighten the security around particularly unclassified information that's out there, and how their suppliers are interacting within the Department of Defense, so we make sure that from a national security perspective, we're as safe as possible. And that came about through a couple of different things. First off, of course, 9/11 caused all of us in America to think about security much more than we had in the past. But from a DoD perspective, the big event happened in 2007 when China hacked not only the Pentagon, but particularly Lockheed Martin for the F-35 program. If you've ever noticed, China's latest generation of fighters, they look quite a bit like the F-35. And so the Department of Defense took on an initiative at that point to try to lock down information and secure information, I guess would be the better way of putting it. And in 2010, there was an executive order about controlled unclassified information. And in 16, we started the DVARS program and implementation of NIST 800-171 as the baseline for that program. When they started to audit folks along those lines, not many folks passed those audits. So they have distilled the program over time into the CMMC program. And just recently, let's say within the last month, they've finalized that program, and we're going to start to see the requirements for certification beginning early next year, and we'll talk through that. For the folks that CMMC doesn't apply to, it's very important to understand kind of how we got here and why particularly customers that I work with the most, my clients tend to be small to medium business and are wondering why all these security rules are going to start to apply to them. And it really came through for me about a year ago when I was at a conference and saw this slide. This slide shows the activity and the targets for these security attacks. And back when these attacks first started, the attacks were basically targeting the big industrial or the big contractors within the DoD. DIB stands for Defense Industrial Base, just because we need another acronym. And so that basically means the top of the top, the Lockheed Martins, the Boeings, the Sikorsky aircraft of the world. Those big, huge government contractors are what we're talking about. And those targets early on were those big companies, those big top of the line defense contractors. Slowly but surely over time, as you can see by this graph, the targets started to go downstream. They started to, the attacks, because those big companies were locking down their systems so well, the attacks started going to their subcontractors, and then the subcontractors of the contractors. So today, most of the attacks are in this small business space, and why it's so important for us to improve security in those smaller companies, and why the CMC rules are starting to affect those. Brian, you want to talk about CMC itself and kind of where we're starting to, where the final ruling is starting to target?
Yeah, thanks, Tucker. So, kind of what is CMMC? So essentially, CMC, it's a unified cybersecurity standard for DoD acquisitions aimed at securing the defense industrial base supply chain, as Tucker had mentioned. And just kind of going back to that initial timeline of kind of how we got here, one of the impetuses was, a DoD Inspector General report, as Tucker had mentioned, found that a lot of these companies that have been complying with DFAR 7012 actually hadn't been implementing the requirements in the first place. So the DoD kind of took a step back and said, okay, we need to put in place a program here where we can obtain, assurance that these contractors are actually implementing these requirements per DFAR 7012. And so, it's so as you mentioned, its goal is to establish and verify that contractors and subcontractors handling FCI data and CUI data have implemented the required security requirements. So what is FCI data? What is CUI data? And I'll just kind of read off a definition here, for FCI and CUI data. But FCI data is defined as information not intended for public release that's provided by or generated for the government under a contract to develop or deliver a product or service to the government, but not including information provided by the government to the public. And so examples of FCI data can be, proposals, RFPs, contracts. And then we have CUI data. So CUI data stands for Controlled and Classified Information. And that essentially is information that by law, regulation, or government-wide policy requires to have safeguarding or disseminating controls. And so typically, CUI data is usually defined within a contract or by the contracting officer. It includes categories noted in the CUI registry that's maintained by NARA. Examples can be, controlled technical information, design drawing. So, it can be as low level as, hey, you're an HVAC provider, but, you have the floor plans to a military base. That floor plan could be CUI data, or it could be as technical as a design drawing for, a fighter jet or a ship. And that would be defined as CUI data that would require protections around. So now we've kind of defined what is FCI data, what is CUI data. Let's kind of talk about the CMC model. And so the CMC model is broken out into 3 maturity levels: level 1, level 2, and level 3. Level 1 has 17 security requirements that are taken from FAR, and that essentially applies to FCI data. So if you're a contractor, you're handling FCI data, you need to comply with level 1. And then we go down to level 2. Level 2 applies to CUI data, but it also incorporates those level 1 requirements for FCI. So if you're a contractor and you comply with level 2, you need to implement those security requirements for CUI data, but you also need to implement those 17 requirements over any FCI data that you have in your environment. And then we get down to level 3. Level 3 is meant for the highest priority programs, critical CUI data. And so within level 3, that builds upon the 110 requirements from level 2, and it adds 24 additional requirements from 800-172. And so, what are the requirements to comply with this? So you can see on kind of the right-hand side of that graph there, level 1 is a self-assessment. So you're a contractor and your contract requires you to be level 1 compliant. Then you need to do a self-assessment of your environment where the FCI data is stored, processed, transmitted to verify that those 17 requirements are implemented. And then you would submit your self-assessment to the SPRS system. And then we go down to level 2. Level 2 is bifurcated. So here, depending on what the government requires in the contract, you could either have a self-assessment requirement, or you could be required to go through a third-party assessment, which would be a C3PAO like Cherry Bekaert, to conduct a level 2 assessment over a CUI data. So that the self-assessment requirement there, that contractor has to have one, you would internally, you go through, conduct a self-assessment. You're required to implement all of the 110 requirements for a self-assessment, and then submit their self-assessment results to the SPRS system. And then, of course, the level 2 third-party assessment, there you would need to go out to a C3PO and have them perform that third-party assessment. They would submit the scores to the EMAS system, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. And then level 3 is a little bit unique, and that for level 3, you need to go to a C3PO, get your level 2 certification. And then once you have your level 2 certification, you go to the government and say, hey, we have our level 2 certification. We're now ready for you to assess us against those 24 additional requirements from 172. They would perform that assessment, and then they would issue the level 3 certification. So just kind of a little overview of the CMC model and kind of what it entails there.
Yeah, if you don't mind, Brian, just for context for folks that are on the call, particularly maybe ABS customers, but folks that are kind of wondering where they're going to fall, things along those lines. I think both you and I agree, 85, 90% of the folks out there, this level 2 is going to apply to them. If particularly if you're going to have, again, those things that you mentioned, things like floor plans, things like technical information, any of those things are going to be level 2. And at least most of the small to medium business customers that I work with, the clients that I'm working with, getting them ready, level 2 is kind of the target right now that we're shooting for. I think you agree with that.
Exactly. Yeah. It's expected a majority of the contractors are going to fall into level 2. And then within level 2, a majority of those are going to require the third-party assessment. So I wouldn't lean on, hey, yeah, it's like they're going to have the self-assessment. Even in the self-assessment requirements, you still have to implement all of the 110 requirements in order to be a compliant. So yeah, I agree with you, Tucker.
Hey guys, Andy's anticipating some data we're going to get to later, but it's a great question. Is there any reimbursement or cost sharing offered by the government for the cost of becoming and remaining certified in this context?
Yeah, it's a good question, John. And so from what I've heard around the ecosystem is that there won't be any cost reimbursements because it's expected, going back to DFR 712 in 2017, that these contractors have already implemented these requirements. They've already been in place. And so the cost for implementing those requirements should have already been incurred going back to 2017 is the government's stance there. Now, regarding the assessment cost, that is a good question. I don't believe, though, from what I've heard, that the assessment costs will be reimbursable, or if they are reimbursable, it will go into your overhead and it will be allocated out through your overhead. But that's more of a question for our government contracting practice that kind of deals with the cost accounting standards. So we can certainly, loop you in with those guys, and they can give you a more detailed answer around the cost accounting standards for getting reimbursed for an assessment.
Yeah, I also think there were lots of rumors before the final ruling around these lines, Brian, where we had heard, at least in the ecosystem, that there was a possibility of reimbursement, things along those lines. When those rumors were flying, it was assumed that you were going to have the audit almost immediately. So I certainly don't want to give anybody any hope that there will be reimbursement at the end, but there has been a little relief in the sense that it's going to be up to a year before you're going to have that true audit. You're going to have to self-attest in 2025, but the audit may bleed into 2026. So there's time for you to prepare for those costs, things along those lines, maybe even build those costs into whatever the bid is that the contract that you're bidding on, things along those lines. So although I don't know if I necessarily agree with it, that's the way the government was approaching it in terms of giving you time to build those costs in. Is that fair, Brian, as far as what you understand too?
Yeah, I mean, I would say if you're a new contractor and you haven't had to comply with these previously, and you are implementing those requirements, then certainly those costs should be reimbursable. But as far as the assessment costs, yeah, correct, Tucker.
Yeah. Do you want to talk through, what most folks, the crux of what everybody's asking, Brian, is kind of timelines and what they need to be thinking about here. So I think it might be a good idea for you to walk through what we know right now as far as the timelines go.
Yeah, certainly. So ultimately, the timeline depends on 48 CFR 252.204-7021, known as the acquisition rule. So when that acquisition rule becomes effective, that then starts this phase implementation process that you can see here on the screen. So just backing up a second, just kind of explain the rulemaking process here. There's two rules that are going through the governmental rulemaking process. You have 32 CFR Part 170. That's the CMC program. And so that essentially stands up the CMC program, which would be the model that we just went through on the last slide. And then you have 48 CFR, or the acquisition rule. That acquisition rule allows the DoD to start requiring CMC compliance within contracts. And so it's expected that 48 CFR will go into effect sometime around spring 2025. So late spring 2025, early summer 2025 is kind of the expectation we've been hearing from the government around when 48 CFR will go into effect. Right now, 48 CFR is completed the public comment period. And so currently it's going through DoD adjudication to adjudicate those public comments. And then we should, and then once that adjudication process gets through, it goes up through OIRA, it goes through OMB, and then it's published in the Federal Register. At that point, it'll become effective. And again, we're anticipating that to be spring, early summer of 2025. And so, kind of what is this 4-phase implementation approach? So, we talked on the last slide, there's 3 different levels: level 1, level 2, level 3. And we talked about how level 2 is bifurcated into the self-assessment and to the third-party assessment requirements. So once 48 CFR goes into effect, that then begins phase 1. Phase 1 allows the DoD to start requiring contractors or to comply with the level 1 self-assessment and the level 2 self-assessment requirements. Now, just want to caveat, always with the government, that there is the ability for the DoD to require level 2 certification requirements in phase 1, but likely that's going to be a subset of the highest priority contracts that would fall into that kind of exception for phase 1. So again, phase 1 is going to start the level 1, level 2 self-assessments. And then 1 year after phase 1 begins, that then begins phase 2. Phase 2 is when the DoD can start requiring contractors to comply with the level 2 certification requirements. And so that's where you go out to a C3PO, get your certification. It's important to note, though, that contractors, even though they may not be certified, you can still bid on a contract. You won't be able to be awarded that contract, though, until you have that certification in hand. And then, so that's phase 2. And then phase 3 begins 1 year after phase 2. So now we're looking at 2027. And that then allows the DoD to start requiring level 3 certifications and contracts. And then 1 year after phase 3, we have full implementation of the program where all compliance across all 3 levels would be required in the contracts.
So, yeah. One thing I wanted to just say, Brian, was there's, I talk with lots of customers and things along those lines. Well, it hasn't been finalized yet, things along those lines. I think it's important to understand that what happened, whatever it was 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, was that the rule became fine. The rule stopped moving as far as what they're going to require. It's the final approval that is the date that hasn't happened. And we expect that to be passed in December. But what's going to be required has stopped moving, I think is important for everybody to understand.
Hey guys, got a question here. When will the requirement be written into existing contracts upon option years being exercised?
They could implement these requirements in those option years. So if you have an active contract right now, until in an option year, the government could come back and say, hey, this option year you need to have a certification in hand. So the DoD at its discretion could include these requirements in those option years.
In addition, we are already seeing contracts that are requiring at the NIST 800-171 in those contracts. And those tend to be the contractors preparing for CMMC, ensuring that the subs that they are contracting with will be able to meet the CMMC certifications very quickly once the rules have been passed.
Yeah, that's a great point, Tucker. And that subcontractors are really, at the mercy of their prime contractors, where their prime contractor could say, "Hey, subcontractor, I need you to have a level 2 certification by June of 2025," even even if it's not in the requirement, and then even if phase 2 hasn't been rolled out by then.
So you want to talk, I know we've got a lot of folks that answered. I'm not sure if it applies to me. I think it's probably important for us to talk through that piece, Brian.
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, at a very high level, CMC is going to apply to DoD prime contractors, subcontractors that are handling FCI data, CUI data, as we've previously discussed. Additionally, though, it's potentially that private companies could also be impacted by CMMC. So we think about private companies, those could be, for example, external service providers and cloud service providers, which we'll talk about a little bit on the next slide. But an example of the external service provider will be ABS. I'm sure Tucker will kind of talk about that a little bit and those requirements. But then you also have, as we kind of mentioned, your subcontractors. We have these flow down requirements, and it can also be from sub to sub. It's not just from prime to sub. And so here you can see the table on the slide. If you're a prime contractor and you have FCI data, so you're required to comply with level 1. Okay, you need to have a level 1 self-assessment. And then your subcontractor, if you're flowing down FCI data to their subcontractors, they also need to have a level 1 self-assessment. And then you have your level 2 self. And if a contractor has CUI data and they're flowing down that CUI data to their subcontractors and they have a self-assessment requirement, then their subcontractors have a self-assessment requirement. For level 2 certification requirement, C3PAO, same concept. If you're a contractor and you're flowing down CUI data to your subcontractors, they also need to have a level 2 certification requirement. And you can see kind of one difference here in level 3. If you're a prime contractor and you have level 3 requirements, but then you're flowing down CUI data to your subs, whether subs need to have a level 2 certification requirement.
I think one of the confusing things for the clients that I've been working with is how am I going to control my subs and that sort of thing. And I think that was very, very vague up until the last couple of months in terms of those folks, at least during the transition year, are going to need to go out and get their self attestations done. And as long as they are in the system with that complete, you're not going to have to worry about your subs. You're only going to have to worry that they've gotten those attestations done and those assessments done. You're not going to have to actually assess your own subs. They are simply going to have to get their certifications.
Right. So guys, let me make sure I understand what you're saying. I have a customer who I know works directly with the DoD and they do construction work. So they're gonna get some of that sensitive data by way of blueprints or floor plans. If they subcontract somebody just to swing a hammer, I guess because they're gonna share those blueprints, that subcontractor's falling into that category of self-attestation.
That is absolutely correct, John.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
It's all around CUI. It's all around if they are touching controlled unclassified information. If that subcontractor has access to that that controlled unclassified information, they are required to be CMMC certified. So the construction industry is folks we work with the most, but it's an excellent example. If that company has access to those blueprints, that is going to be considered CUI. And if they are interacting with it, if they are saving those plans, if they are using it in their system, then they are going to be subject to CMMC requirements for sure. And I want the auditor on the call is nodding his head. I want him to
Yeah,
say yes to the recording.
agreed. Yep.
So, if you don't mind, Brian, let's talk about the concept of the cloud service providers and the external service providers a little bit, and
Yeah.
how that ties in.
Yeah. So as we mentioned kind of the last slide, it could apply to companies outside the DIB, private entities that are supporting contractors within the DIB. So, let's go through a couple of definitions first, since we love acronyms. CSP, what is a cloud service provider? The rule defines a cloud service provider as an external company that provides cloud services based on cloud computing. So what is that? It's essentially defined. So they refer to NIST 145 version September 2011. And so that's what the definition of a cloud service provider is based on, is that NIST 800-145 document. And then external service providers. What's the definition of an external service provider? So an external service provider can be people, technology, or facilities that an organization utilizes for provision and management of IT and/or cybersecurity services on behalf of the organization. So in the CMC program, CY or security protection data must be stored, processed, or transmitted on the external service provider's assets in order to be considered an external service provider. And so there are specific requirements if you're using a cloud service provider, if you're using an external service provider, that you need to make sure that you're meeting in order to become CMC compliant. So a cloud service provider, these requirements here really apply to if you're using cloud service provider to store, process, or transmit CUI data. If you're using a cloud service provider to store, process, transmit security protection data, FCI data, then these specific requirements here do not apply. But if you're using cloud service provider to store, process, transmit CUI data, then that cloud service provider needs to be federate, moderate, or equivalent. And so essentially, what does that mean? So federate, moderate. So as a C3PAO, when they're going through your assessment, they're going to identify who your cloud service providers are. And then they're going to verify if that cloud service provider is storing, processing, transmitting CUI data or not. And if they are, the first thing they're going to do is go to the FedRAMP marketplace and look them up and see if they are FedRAMP authorized at the moderate or above level. So if they are, then yes, check, you're good. They're FedRAMP authorized. However, there's some gray areas here, kind of given the FedRAMP process, and that initially FedRAMP was meant for federal agencies and providing proxy services to federal agencies. But here we're talking about DoD contractors in the private space. So, if you're using a cloud service provider that's not on the FedRAMP marketplace, there's a second option here around equivalency. And so FedRAMP equivalency essentially requires a contractor to prove that that cloud service provider is FedRAMP moderate equivalent. So that essentially, in order for a cloud service provider to be FedRAMP moderate equivalent, it's a high bar. So they'll need to implement. They'll have to have 100% compliance on all of the FedRAMP moderate baseline requirements from 853. So that's 100% compliance, which that's a high bar to meet. And so that they need to show that they're 100% compliant by having a 3PAO assessment. And then additionally, they need to provide to the contractor a system security plan, a security assessment plan, and a security assessment report. So it's a C3PO, we're coming in, if you're using a FedRAMP or if you're using a cloud service provider that is not on the FedRAMP marketplace, but they're trying to show FedRAMP equivalency, it's on the contractor's earnest to prove that. So the C3PO is coming in and saying, hey, show me that they've had a 3PO assessment, that they're 100% compliant. Show me their system security plan. Show me their security assessment plan. Show me their security assessment report. And so as a contractor, you need to provide that to the C3PO. The C3PO isn't doing the assessment to verify the FedRAMP equivalency. And then there's the third option here, which can really kind of blow out the time, effort, cost of your CMC certification, would be if they're not FedRAMP authorized and they're not showing FedRAMP equivalency, then they would need to be part of the assessment. And that C3PO essentially would be assessing them against the FedRAMP moderate baseline controls and verifying that they've implemented it. So that's really going to increase the level of cost complexity of your assessment. And then we kind of move over to external service providers. So as you mentioned, external service providers, these requirements come into play when that external service provider is storing, processing, transmitting CUI data or security protection data. So security protection data is kind of a new category, but it's essentially, you can think of log events, configuration baselines, that type of data. And so essentially, if you are using an external service provider to provide those requirements, then there's kind of a couple options. One, that external provider can have a level 2 certification over their assessment scope or their boundaries, where they're providing their services to you, and they can provide you that level 2 certification. If not, then the external service provider, they need to document in their documentation, their service description, and they need to have a customer responsibility matrix, which essentially goes through all of the 800-171A assessment objectives and identifies which requirements they're responsible for. And then in the contractor's system security plan, the contractor needs to either refer to or document how that external service provider is implementing those requirements they say that they're responsible for. And then that external service provider would need to be part of that contractor CMC level 2 certification assessment. And that C3PO would essentially be assessing those requirements where the external service provider said, hey, we would have responsibility for these. They would be assessing those requirements as if they were part of the contractor themselves. So it's a couple, those are requirements for a cloud service provider and external service provider. I think, Tucker, you want to maybe go through a couple, real world examples?
Yeah, I definitely am going to talk through the cloud service provider aspect in a second, Brian, but I want to spend a little time on the external service provider, the ESP piece of it. So as a managed service provider, this applies directly to us, but for folks on the call that are not advanced business solution customers, if you use some examples here are, again, a managed service provider, if you've outsourced all or part of your IT support, that company is going to fall in and be considered an external service provider for sure. Folks that developers, if you outsource development, those folks would certainly fall into that category. Any supplier that or any vendor you have that has access to your network, and particularly again that CUI data, is going to fall into that external service provider piece. And they basically, Brian did a real good job of walking through it, but they're basically going to have two options. They're either going to have to be CMMC compliant and be able to produce a certification or an attestation, whatever. They're going to have to be certified. Or the second option is that they basically participate in the audit process with you. And there is a delineation as far as the matrix goes, the responsibility matrix goes, that needs to be written and provided, that will basically dictate what part of the audit they're going to participate in and what they don't have to. But I guess at a high level, everyone needs to understand that those providers are going to end up being a part of the audit process in some way or another. And you need to be working with those folks now to figure out what they're going to be responsible for and what they aren't, as far as both the self-attestation as well as the audit when Brian and the C3PAO come in. Those folks are going to be involved for sure.
Yep.
As far as, some details around that goes, let's talk about how you get ready for that, and some of the things you're going to need to do before you even go after the self-attestation. The first is it's really important to get a assessment done ahead of time, a baseline assessment. These requirements are very rigid, and most folks, it takes longer than what they expect it's going to take. Let's put it that way. You really need to go through, identify what the scope of the requirements are for your individual company, understand what level you need to get. Again, we expect most folks are going to need to have a level 2 certification. And if you go through that baseline assessment process, you're going to be able to create a plan and roadmap to remediate the things that you need to remediate in your environment. It could take as much as 6 months or even longer to even get this initial step done. And so don't underestimate how long it's going to take to get all these remediations and gaps filled. A lot of clients I'm working with, it's taken a minimum of 6 months, the folks that are very much ready for this. So again, that first step is that gap assessment and creating a plan to fill those gaps. Most of the clients I work with, the remediations fall into 2 categories: an administrative control remediation and a technical control remediation. This slide doesn't necessarily mean everybody's going to have to do all this, but typically when I start with a client, that gap assessment shows things that fall into these various categories. Most clients I work with, the technical piece, the technical controls, they've got a lot of those done, but small to medium business typically hasn't done the documentation component, the written requirements, and formalized those and truly operationalized all those written policies and procedures. So I typically spend a significant amount of time helping folks create and customize those documents to their environment. And so a inventory, a written inventory and documented inventory, the policies, procedures, specifically for CMMC, they're asking for SSP, which again, another acronym for system security plan. They want that report. And that shared responsibility matrix we were talking about earlier with between you and your outside vendors is going to be really important. Finally, from a small business perspective, one of the gaps that we see in almost every situation that we start with customers is just the employee acknowledgement, making sure that let's understand all of this is about better security and awareness in your environment. And a lot of folks haven't done that step to just increase awareness of all these rules within their employee, within their end users. So once you have those administrative things in place, we start to work on the technical controls. And usually the gaps we see with those technical controls surround the ongoing detection of threats within your environment. A lot of small businesses have not deployed a system for incident and event management. That's a SIM solution is what that acronym is for, or a managed security operations center. So we end up having to deploy those in most of the small businesses, a remediation step that we have to take. A lot of times the encryption rules aren't quite up to snuff, and we have to work on those. The rules state that you have to patch, you have to have patches and updated systems, and that all the systems are on supported operating systems. And one of the big gaps that a lot of end customers have is they're not thinking about that includes those mobile devices that your employees bring into the environment. So a lot of times we have to deploy a mobile device management solution for customers. And then finally, Brian talked about that those cloud service providers have to be FedRAMP compliant. Well, a lot of the small businesses use things like Office 365, for example, with Microsoft. But your Office 365 environment, that tenant needs to be in a specific FedRAMP compliant Microsoft platform. So a lot of times to get you ready for CMMC, we have to migrate you out of the regular Microsoft platform into the FedRAMP compliant platform. The tools to your end users look the same, but that data is sitting on US-based data centers, for instance, and again, conforms with all the FedRAMP compliant rules. That's not just true for your Microsoft platform. That's really true with all your third-party applications that are cloud provided. So when Brian mentioned like third-party cloud providers, we're not talking about AWS or Azure, or if your servers sit up in the cloud. That certainly is a part of the picture, but it also may be your ERP application, your finance application, things that you are using a cloud provider, a cloud application. Those have to be FedRAMP compliant. So a lot of times, those applications, there may be a particular, again, SKU or platform that you have to move to, or licensing that you have to move to ensure that you're using, again, like US-based data centers, things along those lines, and sometimes even US-based support for those applications are some of the rules that apply to those FedRAMP requirements. Did I miss anything there, Brian, as far as the FedRAMP side of it goes?
Yeah, I think that was a great overview, Tucker. Maybe just one point of clarification around the US-based cloud providers. If you are handling, if you're handling, say, specified CUI data that has limited simulation control, say, no foreign requirements, so ITAR data, then you're required to use, say, Microsoft GCC High, which is US-based, or all their data centers are US-based, or support personnel are US-based, versus, say, basic CUI, which can be distributed offshore outside of the continental United States. And so say Azure GCC, okay, they have, data centers across the world or support staff outside the United States. Just want to kind of clarify that, there could be, depending on the types of CUI data that you're handling, you could have requirements where all your support personnel, all your data, all your servers, everything needs to be within the continental United States.
Hey, Tucker, back to your policy procedure documentation remediation. How much of the inventory process procedures is shared with, say, ISO certifications or some other, like we do SOC 2, right, at AVS? Is there a good overlap there that might limit the remediation needs?
Yeah, I think it's really important, John. It's a great question. I think it's really important to understand that all of the frameworks that are out there, Brian is an expert in CMMC, but Cherry works with lots of different frameworks, whether it be SOC, HIPAA, ISO, all of the frameworks that I work with or Brian works with, they're all trying to achieve the same thing, which is security of your network and your data and ensuring you're not being breached. And so I say that because when I look at the rules of CMMC or the underlying framework, which is the NIST framework, the requirements are very similar to ISO, HIPAA, whatever the case may be. They're trying to achieve is the same thing. So if you have gone down one of those other paths, chances are you're doing the right things that will help you be CMMC compliant. It's the certification process basically that changes. You need to make sure you're doing certain things that apply to CMMC, But you can't just say, okay, I'm HIPAA compliant, therefore I'm CMC compliant. You've still got to go through the process of engaging somebody like Brian and having a C3PAO come in and truly certify you.
Yeah, agreed, Tucker. There are, ISO, say 27001. If you've implemented that and you're compliant with ISO 27001, that's certainly a great head start. And when you look through those NXA controls in 27001, there's certainly not an overlap with 800-171. But there are some, unique differences between CMMC and NIST and ISO. For CMC, for example, they're really incorporating bringing in the 800-171A assessment objectives. So we noted back when we were talking about the model, there's 110 requirements within 171, but when you really dig into it, there's 320 assessment objectives within 171A that you as an organization need to make sure that you've implemented. And then I think a question around the inventory was brought up, your asset inventory. For CMC, if you were to go onto the DoD CIO website, there's a level 2 scoping guide. One of the requirements for CMMC is that your asset inventory needs to be appropriately categorized. And so there's various asset categories: CUI assets, security protection assets, contractor risk management assets, specialized assets. And so each of your assets in that inventory needs to be categorized appropriately according to that scoping guide. Just be aware, yes, 27001 is a great head start. There's a ton of overlap between the requirements, but there are specific requirements you need to make sure you've implemented. And that's why going to a company like ABS can help you, make sure that you are complying with those unique requirements for CMMC before you walk into your assessment.
One more question for you guys before we move on, going back to the CUI data. A lot of our projects span over many years. What is the expectation for CUI data obtained/created on an old task order? This particular person is setting up CMMC compliant enclave for future work, but not sure on the expectation for the existing CUI data that sits in their old environment. Does that need to be moved?
So existing CUI data, you should be complying with DFAR 7012. And so DFAR 7012 requires you to implement NIST 171 in order to protect that data. But also when you look at DFAR 7012, that was where the initial FedRAMP equivalency requirements came into play. So if you are using cloud service provider to store, process, transmit that CUI data, then going back to DFAR 712, which has been in place since December 31st, 2017, you do need to be using a FedRAMP authorized or equivalent cloud service provider.
All right, guys, I do want to respect everybody's time, but you should go through this thoroughly. We got about 7 or 8 minutes left. If anybody needs to drop, the recording and the slide deck will be sent out early next week. So if you do have to go, no worries, we'll still get you the information.
Yeah, I think the next quick thing I wanted to mention, John, is basically that this isn't a point in time. Everybody's worried about the certifications, but this is a journey, not a destination, in terms of there are lots and lots and lots of requirements that you have to do on an ongoing basis. Just because we're thinking about the self-attestation early next year and then the audits later in the year next year, it doesn't mean there's still going to be ongoing requirements for you, both from an audit perspective and a self-attestation on an annual basis. So you have to show that you've operationalized a lot of these things. There are ongoing things that you need to do, like regular scheduled security meetings, incident response testing, DR testing, risk management, lots and lots of activities that you not only have to get up and running, but you can't just stamp that you've done it and move on. You have to be doing it on an ongoing schedule. So I think it's, so that's kind of what you do to get ready for the assessment. I think it's probably important for Brian to cover kind of what he's doing when he does come in and do a audit quickly, and then we'll talk about timelines here at the very end.
Yeah, so on the screen here, you can see the requirements for a level 2 assessment. So as mentioned, 110 requirements from 171 need to be implemented. At the end of the day, in order to receive your final certification, you need to have implemented all 110 requirements and have met all the 320 assessment objectives that are applicable to your organization. It's a 3-year certification. In the off years, you do need to submit a self-assessment to the SPRS system by a senior official. Important to note, though, that you are liable to the DoD's False Claims Act, which there's already been a number of false claims filed by the DoD over last year, such as Georgia Tech, and most recently Penn State has kind of been filed or had a claim against the False Claims Act by the DOJ, sorry. And then so, going through an actual assessment timeline, there's 4 key phases of an actual assessment. You have a planning and preparation phase, conducting the assessment, reporting and recommend the results, and then the POAM closeout, if applicable, at the end of phase 4. The phase 1, planning and preparation, this is really where you are providing to the C3PO your system security plan and a catalog of evidence mapped to each of the 320 assessment objectives to show how you've implemented those requirements. During that phase 1 process, the C3PO is really making a decision of whether you guys as a contractor are prepared to move forward with your assessment. So they're looking at things like they're doing spot checks against your asset inventory. Okay, you have contractor risk managed assets that are categorized. Is that appropriate categorization, or should it be a COI asset? Because there's different requirements that are need to be implemented depending on the asset level. And then your external service cloud providers, are you using a FedRAMP authorized cloud service provider? And then the C3PO is essentially saying, okay, yeah, we've did a common spot check through your evidence. We've looked at your scope. The boundaries look like they're appropriately identified. You can move forward with your assessment. And so during that assessment, this process really from phase 1 to phase 3 is really about a 4 to 6 week process, depending on the complexity, size of organization, number of locations, all those sort of things. But during phase 2, when you're actually conducting the assessment, the assessor is scheduling interviews with the control process owners, and they're going through the requirements in real time. Hey, okay, this requirement, show me how you've identified authorized users. And then that process owner is bringing up your authorized user listing to the assessor. They'll be conducting on-site interviews for a sample of locations if you have physical sites in scope. And then, they're scoring at the end of there's interviews. At the end of reviewing the assessment documentation, they're scoring each of the practices against the 320 assessment objectives where you met or not met. If you have one of the 110 requirements, say, may have 4 or 5 assessment objectives. If you scored a not met against one of those assessment objectives, then that requirement is not met. So you have to have a met for each of those assessment objectives under each of the requirements in order to be compliant. So it's really important, going back to those 320 assessment objectives, that you've implemented it. I know, Tucker, you're pushing me along a little bit, and then it goes through a CCA quality review, we report the recommended results. If there are POAMs at the end, there's what's called allowed POAMs and not allowed POAMs. If you have requirements where you've not met and they're not allowed to have a POAM, then you fail your assessment. You don't receive a certification. You have to re-engage with the C3PO again. If you do have items that are allowed to have a POAM, then there's what's called a POAM closeout assessment. And so at the end of that initial assessment, you guys as the contractor have 180 days to remediate and have those requirements reassessed by the C3PO. So if you've fully closed out those POAMs and they've been reassessed, then at the end of that POAM closeout assessment, you would receive a final certification stating that you've implemented all 110 requirements, and that'll be a 3-year certification.
Brian, if you get started with an assessor or auditor like yourself, and you run into that POAM doesn't qualify, we have to start over. Is the customer paying twice for your engagements?
Yeah, that's good. That's a good question, John. It really kind of depends. From phase 1, and we're going through the scope, and we're saying, okay, yeah, you guys haven't scoped this properly. You need to do some more work. We'll pause the engagement there. The contractor can go back, fix their scope, fix their system security plan, fix their asset inventory. If it's a cloud service provider, then there may be some time there in switching your cloud service provider to a compliant one. But typically during phase 1, if you kind of pause the assessment, we haven't really incurred that much time and effort. So we'll pause it there. You guys can come back and we'll re-engage phase 1 once you guys are ready. When we go into phase 2, we're conducting a full assessment against 110 requirements. So once you've moved into phase 2, you've essentially are going through the entire assessment process. So at the end of phase 2, you'll have all your 110 requirements and 320 assessment objectives assessed, and you'll know whether you've met or not met those requirements, and then you would have to go back and fix what's not met, and you would have to re-engage with a C3 appeal again for that assessment, and incur the additional costs for it.
Yeah, I think it's really important to reiterate the idea that when they do a POAM, that there are some things that are going to be allowed on that POAM and some that are not. So the work ahead of time is really important, that you understand before you even have that assessment done where you're at, and make sure you understand where the potential holes are. So if there's one slide to take away, it's probably this one, as far as timelines go and what you need to be prepping for so that you are ready for those audits and things along those lines. This is a sample timeline, but I think it's good to make sure everybody kind of understands the work that's ahead of them to be ready. And if I started with a customer today, it would be January before we have that baseline assessment done. The remediation process, again, takes 3 to 4 months just to get the technical and administrative remediations in place. And so that would get you really ready for a self-attestation in the second quarter of next year. And that would then allow you to be able to engage with Brian, let's say in the fourth quarter or first quarter of next year, to be able to hit all the marks that are being required. And then you're going to have to do an annual self-attestation after that. And then once every 3 years have to do the audit with Brian and a C3 PAO again. So, just because they are requiring these things in the second or third quarter of next year doesn't mean that you have time. It's really important to start working now because of how rigid these requirements are, and what's going to be required of you if you want to not bid, but have a contract, accept a contract that's requiring a CMMC requirement.
Guys, this was a lot. I think from my perspective, I was educated a little bit on where ABS needs to be. I always thought that it was going to roll completely downhill, and CMMC certification was a requirement for us. So that's a bit of relief for me. I did throw into the chat any final questions. I did get one. Who can help me start? We need to get started on step 1 ASAP. And I think this is a great time to say either one of our companies can help you get started with step 1. However, if Cherry Bekaert, and hold me accountable here, Brian, if Cherry Bekaert is your auditor, they can't do the assessment or the readiness ahead of that, correct?
Correct. Yeah, there are strict independence requirements for CMMC. If you help consulting or advising on the requirements, then you're conflicted out from doing the assessment, and vice versa.
Very good. So reach out to either of us. We got contact information on the screen. I want to give a special thanks to Cherry Bekaert for partnering with us on this. They do our SOC 2 audit. We went through a pretty rigorous vendor selection process, and they were head and shoulders above everybody that we talked to. Brian, thanks for your time. Tucker, yours as well. Great job today. Everybody that joined us and stuck around, appreciate it. We'll get the presentation and the recording out early next week. Everybody have a great day and enjoy your weekend.